The mansion was quiet at midnight, except for one door that kept opening. No one knew that the billionaire's only son, 18-year-old Julian, slipped out of his gold-lined bedroom every night and disappeared into the servants' quarters. What he did there, if anyone had seen it, could have destroyed his family's name forever. This isn't a story about scandal or forbidden romance. This is about something far more dangerous in the eyes of the wealthy: compassion that crosses the lines money built to keep people apart. As his father always say in a voice that allowed no argument, servants should never be treated as equals. Remember your place and make sure they remember theirs. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Why would a billionaire's son risk everything to sneak into a poor maid's room? What secret bond tied them together so tightly that he'd defy his father, the most powerful man in Atlanta? And when the family finally discovered what was happening behind that closed door, why did it change all their lives in ways none of them could have predicted? The Montgomery family didn't just have money. They had the kind of wealth that built hospitals with their name on bronze plaques, that funded political campaigns, that made mayors return phone calls within the hour. Charles Montgomery ran a real estate empire that stretched across 3 states, and he ran his household the same way he ran his business, with absolute control and zero tolerance for anything that might tarnish the family reputation. His wife, Patricia, came from old money herself, the kind that whispered instead of shouted, that smiled politely while enforcing iron rules about who belonged where. Julian was their only child, and from the moment he could understand words, he'd been groomed to take over the empire. Private schools where his classmates arrived in chauffeured cars. Summer internships at the family company. Carefully curated friendships with other wealthy families. Everything in his life had been planned, measured, controlled. But there was something in Julian that his father's money couldn't buy or discipline couldn't break. A conscience that asked uncomfortable questions. He noticed things. The way his father would speak to the household staff without making eye contact, as if they were furniture that happened to talk. The way his mother would praise the cooking but never learn the chef's name. The invisible rules that kept the people who cleaned their toilets and cooked their food in a separate category of human. By the time Julian was 16, these observations had started to burn inside him. A slow fire of shame and anger that he didn't know what to do with. Imani had been working in the Montgomery household for 8 months when Julian first really saw her. She'd been hired through an agency that staffed luxury homes, one of 6 people who kept the 12,000-square-foot mansion running smoothly. Her official title was housekeeping assistant, which meant she cleaned bathrooms, changed sheets, polished silver, and did whatever other tasks the head housekeeper assigned. She was quiet, efficient, and nearly invisible, which was exactly how the Montgomerys preferred their staff. But Imani carried weight that had nothing to do with the Montgomery mansion. Every paycheck she earned was split 3 ways: rent for the 1-bedroom apartment she shared with her younger sister Zara in College Park, medication for Zara's asthma, and slow payments on the medical debt from their mother's cancer treatment 3 years ago. Their mother hadn't survived, and their father had disappeared long before that, leaving Imani to raise a 13-year-old while working 60-hour weeks for families who never looked at her long enough to see she was brilliant. She'd been 2 semesters away from a nursing degree at Georgia State when her mother got sick. She'd withdrawn to take care of her, then stayed withdrawn after she died because someone had to pay the bills and Zara needed stability more than Imani needed dreams. She read medical journals on the bus. She practiced Spanish with YouTube videos during her lunch breaks. She filled notebooks with plans for going back to school someday, somehow, when the debt was paid and Zara was older. Julian first noticed her on a Tuesday evening in March. He'd come down to the kitchen past midnight, hungry after spending hours studying for his college entrance exams. The main house was dark, but he saw light coming from the small hallway that led to the servants' quarters. He'd walked past that hallway 1,000 times without thinking about what was beyond it. That night, curiosity pulled him forward. Through a partially open door, he saw Imani sitting on the floor of a room that couldn't have been more than 8 feet by 10 feet. She had a textbook open on her lap, the kind with dense medical terminology that Julian recognized from his own biology classes. She was mouthing words silently, testing herself, her finger tracing lines of text. Her phone buzzed and she picked it up, her face transforming with worry as she read a message. He watched her close her eyes and press her palm against her forehead, breathing slowly like she was trying to hold herself together. He should have walked away. That would have been the appropriate thing, the thing that respected her privacy and maintained the invisible walls his parents had built. But something in her expression, the exhaustion and determination mixed together, stopped him. He knocked softly on the door frame. She looked up, startled, and immediately stood, her professional mask sliding into place. "Mr. Julian, I'm sorry, is there something you need?" "I saw your textbook," he said, which was a stupid thing to say but the truth. Her eyes flickered with something, surprise maybe, before she carefully neutralized her expression. "I'm just reviewing some old material. Can I get you something from the kitchen?" "You're studying?" He stepped into the doorway, not entering her room but not leaving either. She hesitated, calculating whether honesty was safe. I had to stop. But I like to keep up with the material when I can. I was studying nursing." "Why did you have to stop?" Another calculation. Her jaw tightened. "Life happened, Mr. Julian. It happens to people like me." That phrase, "people like me," landed like a challenge. He heard his father's voice in it, the invisible line it drew. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant it in a way that surprised him with its intensity. "That's not fair." "Fair doesn't pay bills," she said simply. Then softer, "You should go back upstairs. If Mrs. Montgomery sees you down here." She didn't finish the sentence, but they both knew what she meant. There were rules, unspoken but absolute. He nodded and left, but something had shifted. He couldn't stop thinking about that textbook, about the life she'd had to pause, about the tiny room with its single window and the way she'd looked when that text message arrived. 2 days later he came back. He brought a sandwich from dinner, wrapped in a napkin, and knocked on her door at 11 o'clock. She opened it with confusion and alarm in her eyes. "I noticed you didn't eat much at the staff dinner," he said, which was a lie. He had no idea what the staff ate. "I thought you might be hungry." "Mr. Julian, you can't be here." "I know. But you're hungry and I have food." He held out the sandwich. "Please. It's just going to waste otherwise." She stared at him for a long moment, then took the sandwich with hands that trembled slightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "But you really can't come back here. If anyone sees." "I'll be careful," he promised. That's how it started. A sandwich, then another the next night. Then a conversation about her studies that stretched past midnight. Then books from his father's library that he'd smuggled to her room, medical texts and anatomy guides that collected dust on shelves because no Montgomery had ever been interested in actual medicine, only in the hospitals they funded for tax deductions and social capital. Within 2 weeks, Julian was sneaking into the servants' quarters every night. He'd wait until his parents were asleep, until the house settled into its expensive silence, then slip down the back stairs to Imani's door. They'd sit on the floor of her tiny room, backs against opposite walls, and he'd quiz her on terminology or they'd discuss the chapters she'd read. Sometimes they just talked about her sister, about his pressure cooker life, about the absurdity of a world where he had everything and she had nothing despite being twice as smart. "You could go to any college you want," she told him one night, frustration creeping into her usually measured voice. "You could study anything, become anything, and you're going into real estate because your father decided so." "I know," he said quietly. "I think about that every day." "Then why don't you choose something else?" "Because I'm a coward." The admission hurt, but it was true. "Because disappointing my father feels impossible. Because I don't know who I am without all of this." He gestured vaguely at the mansion above them. She studied him in the dim light of her single lamp. "You're not a coward. You're here, aren't you? You're not supposed to be, but you come anyway. That's different." "Is it?" "You're choosing to see me as human. In your world, that takes courage." The conversations evolved. He started teaching her things too, not academic subjects but the unspoken rules of his world. How to read people in power. How to navigate conversations with wealthy people who could help her someday. He brought his laptop and they'd look up scholarships, nursing programs with evening classes, strategies for getting back into school. They made plans together, futures built on hope and borrowed Wi-Fi. But Julian did more than plan. He started stealing from his own house, not calling it that but knowing that's what it was. Cash from his mother's purse, always small amounts she wouldn't notice. Gift cards his father received and never used. A gold cufflink from a set his father hadn't worn in years, sold to a pawn shop for $300 that went toward Zara's inhaler prescription. He'd bring Imani groceries hidden in his backpack, expensive items from their kitchen that he'd blame on the catering staff if anyone noticed. Organic fruit. Good cheese. The leftovers from dinner parties that would otherwise be thrown away because his mother believed serving day-old food to guests was vulgar. "You're going to get caught," Imani warned him constantly. "Julian, you have to stop. This is too risky." "I don't care," he'd say and mean it more each time. But someone did notice. Mrs. Chin, the head housekeeper, had worked for wealthy families for 30 years. She'd developed an instinct for things that were out of place, patterns that didn't fit. She noticed food disappearing. She noticed Mr. Julian's late-night wanderings, the way he'd slip down the back stairs around 11 o'clock and return an hour later. She noticed the softness in his eyes when he'd accidentally cross paths with Imani during the day, the way Imani seemed less tired despite working the same brutal hours. Mrs. Chin had seen this before and it never ended well. In her experience, when wealthy boys paid attention to poor girls who worked in their houses, someone always got hurt, and it was never the boy. She watched and waited, gathering evidence until she was certain. Then she did what she'd been hired to do. She protected the family's interests. She told Mrs. Montgomery first, knowing Patricia would be more receptive than Charles to handling this quietly. She explained what she'd observed, carefully framing it as concern for the family's reputation and young Mr. Julian's future. Patricia's face had gone through several emotions in quick succession. Disbelief, anger, embarrassment, and finally, cold calculation. "You're certain they're meeting alone? At night?" "Yes, ma'am. In her quarters. Nearly every night for the past month." Patricia closed her eyes briefly. "Does my husband know?" "Not yet, ma'am. I thought you should be informed first." "You did the right thing. Don't tell him yet. Let me handle this." But Patricia didn't handle it quietly. Maybe she couldn't face her husband's fury alone, or maybe she believed he deserved to know immediately. That evening, when Charles came home from his office, she told him everything. And Charles Montgomery, who'd built an empire on control and image, felt that control slipped through his fingers like water. He didn't yell at first. The truly powerful don't need to yell. He simply walked down to the servants' quarters at 9 o'clock that evening, knocked on Imani's door and waited. When she opened it, still in her work clothes, exhaustion evident in every line of her body, he looked at her with an expression that she'd remember for the rest of her life. Disgust mixed with something worse, disappointment that she dared to cross an invisible line. "Pack your things," he said quietly. "You have 1 hour. I want you out of my house." "Mr. Montgomery, I don't understand." "Don't insult my intelligence. You've been meeting with my son. Alone. At night. In your room." Each sentence landed like a stone. "I don't know what game you're playing, what you thought you'd accomplish, but it ends now. It's not what you think. I don't care what it is. You're fired. No final paycheck. You're lucky I'm not calling the police and having you arrested for whatever this is." "Arrested? For what?" Her voice rose despite her fear. "We were studying. Talking. That's all. My 18-year-old son has been sneaking into your bedroom every night, and you expect me to believe you were studying?" His laugh was cruel. "I've met people like you before. You see a wealthy family, a naive boy, and you think you've found your ticket out. Not in my house." Imani felt something break inside her chest, something that had been holding her together through years of loss and exhaustion. "I never asked him to come. I told him to stop. I told him it was dangerous. But he's lonely, Mr. Montgomery, and maybe if you actually talk to your son instead of just planning his life." The slap came fast, his palm connecting with her cheek with enough force to snap her head sideways. She staggered back, hand flying to her face, eyes wide with shock. "You don't speak about my family. You don't speak about my son. You take your things and you leave, and if I ever see you near this property again, if you ever try to contact Julian, I will destroy you. Do you understand me? I will bury you in legal fees. I will make sure you never work in this city again. I will make your life so miserable you'll wish you'd never been born." He left her standing there, cheek burning, tears finally breaking through. She had 45 minutes before he'd send someone to physically remove her. She packed her few belongings into a duffel bag with shaking hands, changed out of her uniform, and wrote a note to Julian on the back of a receipt because she had no other paper. "Thank you for seeing me. Please don't give up on being kind. The world needs it." She left it on the small table in her room and walked out through the servants' entrance, past Mrs. Chin who wouldn't meet her eyes, past the kitchen where the other staff whispered and stared, out into the Atlanta night with no job, and no plan beyond getting home to Zara. Julian didn't know any of this had happened. He'd been in his room studying, headphones on, music loud to drown out the silence of the house. He'd planned to visit Imani around 11 like always, bringing her a book on pharmacology he'd ordered online. He came down the back stairs at 11:15, excited to see her face when she opened the package. Her door was ajar. The room was empty. Her few possessions were gone. The bed was stripped bare. The only evidence she'd ever existed there was the note on the table, weighted down with a small ceramic elephant she'd kept on her nightstand, a gift from her sister. He stood in that empty room, note in his hand, understanding crashing over him like cold water. He ran upstairs, taking steps 2 at a time, and burst into his father's study without knocking. Charles looked up from his desk, unsurprised. "I was wondering when you'd notice." "Where is she?" "What did you do?" "I fired her. She's gone. And before you embarrass yourself further with whatever misguided heroics you're considering, understand this. She was using you. Whatever she told you, whatever act she put on, it was manipulation. She saw an opportunity. You don't know anything about her." Julian's voice cracked. "You didn't even try to understand. You just assumed." "I assumed correctly. She's a maid, Julian. A maid who got her hooks into my son and saw dollar signs. I did what any father would do. I protected my family." "By hitting her?" "Did you protect the family by hitting her?" Charles's expression didn't change, which was confirmation enough. She was out of line. She needed to understand consequences. She was studying. We were talking. That's all we were doing. At night. In her bedroom. You're 18 years old, Julian. You're not a child, and neither is she. What do you think people would say if this got out? What do you think this does to our name?" "I don't care about our name." The words exploded out of him, years of pressure finally breaking through. "I don't care about the reputation or the business or any of it. She matters more than all of that. She's brilliant and kind, and she's lost everything, and the only thing I could do was be her friend, and you took that away too. You'll thank me someday." Charles returned his attention to the papers on his desk, dismissing his son. "You'll understand that I saved you from making a mistake that would have haunted you forever. Now go to your room. We're done discussing this." But they weren't done. Julian stood there, shaking with rage and grief, and made a decision that would change everything. "Where does she live?" "You're not going to see her. I'm 18. You can't stop me. I can cut you off. I can make sure you have nothing. Is that what you want? To throw away your future for a girl you barely know? I know her better than I've ever known anyone in this house." Julian's voice was steady now, cold with certainty. "And yes, if that's what it takes, then do it. Cut me off. See if I care." He left the study, went to his room, and grabbed his laptop. It took him 20 minutes to access his father's files and find Imani's employment records with her address. College Park, a neighborhood his father wouldn't drive through if it was the only road to heaven. He took his car keys, his wallet with $300 cash, and left through the front door at midnight, knowing his father would be watching, knowing this was the point of no return. If this story has your heart racing, comment, "I'm still watching right now." Let's see who's truly following till the end. Because what happens next will break you in ways you can't imagine yet. Asterisk asterisk. The apartment building where Imani lived with Zara was a 4-story walk-up with flickering hallway lights and the smell of mildew that no amount of cleaning could eliminate. Julian found apartment 3C and knocked, aware that he had no plan beyond needing to see her, to apologize for his father, to somehow make this right. Zara opened the door, 13 years old, with Imani's eyes and a wariness that childhood poverty creates. "Who are you?" "I'm Julian. I knew your sister. Is she here?" "Imani." Zara called over her shoulder, suspicion clear in her voice. "A boy is here to see you." Imani appeared behind her sister, still in the clothes she'd left the mansion in, her cheek bruised where Charles had struck her. When she saw Julian, her expression cycled through shock, fear, and anger before settling on exhaustion. "You shouldn't be here." "I know. I'm sorry. I didn't know he was going to fire you. I didn't know he hit you. If I'd known." What would you have done?" Her voice was flat. "You're 18, Julian. You live in your father's house. You drive your father's car. You wear your father's money in every thread of those clothes. What exactly would you have done?" The truth of it stung because she was right. "I don't know. But I'm here now. I want to help." "We don't need your help." She started to close the door. "Wait." He pulled out his wallet, took out all $300 and held it toward her. "Please. Take this. For Zara's medicine. For rent. For whatever you need." "I'm not taking your money. It's not charity. It's payment for what my father stole from you. Your job, your paycheck. You can't tell me you don't need it." Imani stared at the money in his hand, pride warring with reality. Zara's inhaler was almost empty. Rent was due in a week. Her savings had exactly $73 in them. She took the money with hands that shook. "Thank you," she whispered. "Now please go. Your father made it very clear what would happen if I contacted you." "He threatened you?" "He promised me. There's a difference. Julian, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but you being here puts me in danger. If he finds out." "He won't. He has people who watch things. People who report back to him. You think you drove across town without him knowing? You think he won't check your bank accounts, track your car, monitor everything you do now that he knows about us? She was right again, and the realization of how trapped they both were settled over him like a weight. Then I'll be careful. I'll find ways to help that he can't track. Julian, my father is wrong about you. About us. About everything. And I'm not going to let him win. I'm not going to let him make you disappear like you never mattered. Imani looked at him for a long moment, this boy from a different world who'd somehow seen past all the walls to recognize her humanity. You can't save me, she said gently. But you can choose not to become him. That's the help I actually need. Promise me you won't let his cruelty make you cruel. I promise. Then go home. Live your life. Be better than what you come from. That's enough. But it wasn't enough for Julian. Over the following weeks, he became someone he didn't recognize. Sneaky, calculating, willing to lie to his own family. He sold things, carefully chosen items from his room that his parents wouldn't notice missing. A watch he'd received for his 16th birthday, never worn. Gaming systems he'd outgrown. Limited edition sneakers still in their boxes. He opened a new bank account his father didn't know about and deposited the money there, then sent it to Imani through anonymous money transfers that couldn't be traced back to him. At first, she tried to refuse, sending the money back with messages telling him to stop. But then Zara had an asthma attack that landed her in the emergency room, and the bill was $1,800. Imani accepted the money Julian sent and stopped trying to refuse his help. She told herself it was temporary, that she'd pay him back someday, but they both knew the truth. She needed him, and he needed to be needed. Charles Montgomery noticed his son's new quietness, the way he'd retreat to his room and barely speak at dinner. He noticed the distance growing between them, cold and wide as a canyon. He told himself it was necessary, that Julian would understand in time, that he'd done what fathers do to protect their sons from their own foolishness. Patricia said nothing, which was her way of saying everything. 3 months after Imani was fired, Julian graduated high school. His father threw him a party at the mansion, invited 200 people from their social circle, and gave a speech about legacy and responsibility and the bright future ahead. Julian smiled for photos and accepted congratulations and felt like he was watching his life from outside his body. That night, after everyone left, he took the graduation gifts he'd received, mostly cash and gift cards totaling over $5,000, and drove to College Park. Imani was working a night shift at a 24-hour diner, the only job she could find that didn't require references. He sat in a booth and waited for her break, watching her serve coffee to truck drivers and late-night customers with the same grace she'd brought to serving his family's dinner parties. When she finally sat down across from him, exhaustion carved into her features, he slid an envelope across the table. What's this? Graduation money. I want you to use it to go back to school. She opened the envelope, saw the stack of bills and closed it quickly. Julian, I can't. This is too much. It's not enough. It's not even close to enough. But it's a start. Your father will notice this missing. It's my money. Graduation gifts. He has no claim to it. He leaned forward, urgent. Imani, you're going to waste away in places like this, working yourself to death for minimum wage plus tips, when you should be in a nursing program saving lives. Let me do this one thing. Please. She looked at him, this boy who'd somehow become a man in the months since she'd cleaned his family's toilets, and felt her resistance crack. Why do you care so much? Because you're the first person who ever made me feel like what I thought mattered. Like who I was mattered, separate from my last name and my father's money. Because you're brilliant and you deserve a chance, and if I can give you that, then maybe all this privilege means something. Imani took the envelope, tears streaming down her face. I'll pay you back. Every cent. I don't want you to pay me back. I want you to become a nurse and help people and prove my father wrong about everything. That's payment enough. With Julian's money, Imani enrolled in night classes at a community college, working toward an associate degree in nursing. It wasn't the bachelor's program she'd once been in, but it was progress, movement forward instead of the endless treading water she'd been doing. Zara started doing better too, with consistent access to her medication and enough food in the apartment. They weren't thriving, but they were surviving, and sometimes that's its own kind of victory. Julian, meanwhile, started college at Emory, his father's alma mater, studying business like he was supposed to. He hated every class, every networking event, every conversation about market trends and investment strategies. But he showed up, did the work, maintained the facade because he'd learned something from Imani. Sometimes survival means playing a long game. He kept sending money when he could, kept checking in through carefully hidden methods, kept the promise he'd made in her apartment that night. His father began to relax, believing his son had finally accepted his place in the world. Charles saw the grades, the internship Julian took at the family company, the appropriate girlfriend from an appropriate family who lasted 6 months before Julian couldn't pretend anymore. He saw compliance and called it maturity, not recognizing the quiet rebellion happening in the spaces he couldn't see. 2 years passed like this, Julian and Imani living parallel lives that intersected in secret. She finished her associate degree and got hired as a medical assistant at a community health clinic in East Atlanta. He continued his business degree, learning everything about his father's company while secretly hating it. They'd meet sometimes carefully at places where no one from his world would see them. Libraries in distant neighborhoods, parks on weekday afternoons, coffee shops where the clientele didn't wear designer labels. In these meetings, they weren't the billionaire's son and the former maid. They were just two people who'd somehow found each other across impossible distance, who'd built something fragile and real in the spaces between worlds. They talked about her patients, his classes, Zara's progress in school, his growing certainty that he couldn't spend his life doing work he despised. They talked about everything except what they were to each other because naming it felt dangerous, like speaking a truth out loud might shatter it. But Charles Montgomery had not built an empire by being unobservant. He noticed things his son thought were hidden. Unexplained absences, money that moved in patterns that didn't quite make sense, a distance in Julian's eyes that suggested his mind was elsewhere. He had Julian followed, discreetly, by professionals who knew how to stay invisible. And when the reports came back with photos of Julian sitting in a coffee shop with Imani, laughing like he'd never laughed at home, Charles felt something cold settle in his chest. He'd thought this problem solved years ago. He'd thought his son had moved on, learned his lesson, understood the natural order of things. The discovery that Julian had been seeing her all this time, helping her, betraying the family's boundaries in a sustained and deliberate way, felt like a personal attack. His son had chosen a maid over his own father. Had chosen loyalty to someone worthless over loyalty to the family name. Charles called Julian into his study on a Saturday morning in November, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. Julian came, expecting another lecture about career planning or family obligations. He found his father sitting behind his desk with a folder open, photographs spread across the mahogany surface. "Sit down," Charles said quietly. Julian sat, saw the photographs, and felt his stomach drop. There he was with Imani, evidence of every secret meeting, every coffee shop conversation, every carefully hidden intersection of their lives. "I'm disappointed," Charles said, which was worse than anger. Not surprised but disappointed. "I thought you were smarter than this. I thought you understood what I was protecting you from. You're not protecting me. You're controlling me. I'm doing what fathers do. I'm ensuring you don't throw away everything I've built for a woman who will never be accepted in our world. Tell me, Julian, what's your plan here? You marry her, bring her to family events, introduce her to our business partners as the former maid who's now your wife? You think that works out well for anyone? I think if that's how our world works, then our world is broken." Noble sentiment. Doesn't change reality. Charles closed the folder. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to stop seeing her. Immediately. Completely. No contact, no money, no secret meetings. You're going to focus on your education and your future with this family. And if I don't? Then I cut you off. Completely. No more tuition, no more trust fund, no more place in this family. You can go be noble with nothing, see how long that lasts." Julian had known this moment would come eventually. He'd thought about it during sleepless nights, rehearsed responses, steeled himself for the choice. But sitting there with his father's ultimatum hanging in the air, he found he'd already made his decision long ago. "Okay," he said quietly. Charles blinked, surprised by the easy capitulation. "Okay. Cut me off. Do whatever you need to do. I'm done choosing your world over people who actually matter. You're being dramatic. I'm being honest for the first time in my life." Julian stood up. "I've spent 20 years being who you wanted me to be, learning what you wanted me to learn, preparing to take over a business I don't believe in. And I'm done. You can have your empire. I'll take my conscience." "You'll fail," Charles said, anger finally breaking through. "You have no idea how hard the world is without money. You'll come crawling back within a year, begging for your place back. Maybe. But at least I'll know I tried to be something other than you." Julian walked out of that study and didn't return. He packed his belongings into his car, withdrew what little money he had in accounts his father couldn't access, and drove to Imani's apartment with no plan beyond knowing he couldn't go back. The immediate aftermath was harder than Julian had imagined. His father wasn't bluffing. Within 24 hours, Julian's credit cards were canceled, his phone disconnected, his access to family accounts revoked. He moved into Imani's apartment, sleeping on the couch while Zara got the bedroom and Imani slept on a mattress on the floor. The apartment that had felt small for 2 people became claustrophobic with 3, but they made it work because what choice did they have? Julian got a job at a warehouse loading trucks for $12 an hour. His co-workers laughed at his soft hands, the way he'd never lifted anything heavier than a textbook. He learned fast, pushed through the physical exhaustion, and discovered he could do hard things when they mattered. Imani picked up extra shifts at the clinic. Zara helped however she could, taking on more responsibilities around the apartment, stretching groceries with the skills of someone who'd learned poverty young. Money was constantly tight, but they were surviving. More than surviving, Julian felt something he'd never experienced in the mansion, a sense of purpose that came from earning his place in the world rather than inheriting it. He and Imani grew closer in ways that the secrecy had never allowed, building a life together in the mundane details of shared meals and utility bills and laughter in a cramped living room. 6 months after Julian left home, he got a call from his mother. He'd gotten a new phone by then, a prepaid model that barely held a charge, but he'd never given her the number. Patricia Montgomery had resources that could find anyone. "Your father had a heart attack," she said without preamble. "He's in the hospital. He's asking for you." Julian felt too many things at once: concern, anger, guilt, vindication. Is he going to be okay? They don't know yet. "Julian, I realize you and your father have had disagreements, but he's still your father. Will you come?" He looked at Imani, who'd heard enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. She nodded, even though they both knew what this meant, the world he'd walked away from pulling him back. Piedmont Hospital's cardiac unit catered to exactly the kind of wealthy patients the Montgomerys were. Charles had a private room that looked more like a hotel suite, every comfort available to make illness more bearable for those who could afford it. Patricia was sitting by his bedside when Julian arrived, her makeup perfect despite the circumstances, her posture rigid with the control that had defined her entire life. Charles looked smaller in the hospital bed, hooked up to monitors and IVs, his skin pale against the white sheets. When he saw Julian, something flickered in his eyes, relief, maybe, or regret. "You came," Charles said, his voice weaker than Julian had ever heard it. "Mom said you asked for me." "I did." Charles shifted slightly, wincing. "The doctors say I need to reduce stress. Make peace with things. Your mother thinks that includes you. Does it?" Charles was silent for a long moment. "I don't know how to do this. How to be the kind of father who accepts what you've chosen. You could start by trying. She's still a maid, Julian. She's still from a world that has nothing to do with ours. She's a medical assistant. She's 2 semesters from a nursing degree. And you're right, she's from a different world. One where people actually work for what they have instead of inheriting it." Patricia interjected softly, "Julian, your father nearly died. Can we not do this right now?" But Charles held up his hand. "No, let him speak. I'm listening." Julian hadn't expected that. He'd prepared for confrontation, not conversation. "You were wrong about her. You've been wrong about everything. She didn't use me. She tried to push me away, tried to protect herself from exactly what happened. And when you fired her, when you hit her and threatened her, you didn't protect me. You showed me who you really are." "And who am I?" Charles asked, something dangerous in the question. "Someone who values reputation over people. Money over compassion. Control over love. Someone I don't want to become." The words hung in the sterile air. Patricia looked away. Charles closed his eyes, and for a moment Julian thought he'd pushed too far, that his father would throw him out even from a hospital bed. But when Charles opened his eyes again, they were wet. "You're right," he said, so quietly Julian almost didn't hear it. "About all of it. You're right, and I don't know how to be different." Julian sat down in the chair beside the bed, exhausted suddenly. "You could start by apologizing to her. Would she even see me? I don't know. But you could try." Charles did try, though it took him 3 weeks to work up to it. He was released from the hospital with strict instructions about diet, exercise, and stress management. The heart attack had been a warning, the doctors said, not the final event. He could live years more if he made changes, or he could ignore the warning and have the next heart attack kill him. Charles, who'd built his life on control, found himself facing the ultimate loss of it. He called Imani himself, a phone call that Julian knew about but didn't facilitate. She almost didn't answer when she saw the Montgomery name on her caller ID, but curiosity won out. "Ms. Imani," Charles said, using her name for possibly the first time. I'm calling to ask if you would meet with me. There are things I need to say to you in person. She met him at a coffee shop in Midtown, neutral territory that belonged to neither of their worlds. Julian offered to come, but she told him this was something she needed to do alone. She arrived early and watched through the window as Charles got out of his town car, moving more carefully than she remembered, age and illness evident in ways his expensive clothes couldn't hide. He sat down across from her with 2 coffees he'd ordered ahead. They sat in silence for a moment, 2 people who'd last seen each other in the worst moment of both their lives. "Thank you for coming," Charles said finally. "Why am I here, Mr. Montgomery?" "To receive an apology you're owed." He took a breath. "I was wrong. About you, about my son, about everything I said and did that night. I saw you as a threat to my control, my plans, my family's image. I never saw you as a person with your own dignity, your own dreams, your own right to be treated with basic human respect. I'm sorry." Imani studied him, looking for the trap, the manipulation, the angle. But she saw only an old man facing his mortality and trying to make peace with his mistakes. "You hit me. You threatened to destroy me. You fired me without pay for the crime of being kind to your son. I know. And I have no excuse that makes any of that acceptable. I was raised to believe that people like us and people like you existed in separate categories, that maintaining those categories was essential to the natural order. I taught my son the same poison, and I'm grateful he was smart enough to reject it. He gave up everything for me. His trust fund, his place in your family, his entire future. Do you understand what you cost him?" "I do. And I'm here to ask, not demand, ask, if there's any possibility of fixing some of that damage. Not by bringing him back into my world on my terms, but by finding a way to exist in his world on his terms." Imani didn't trust easily. Years of disappointment had taught her to look for the catch, the betrayal hiding behind kind words. But she also recognized genuine remorse when she saw it, and Charles Montgomery looked like a man who'd been broken open by fear and was trying to figure out how to rebuild himself into something better. "I don't know if I can forgive you," she said honestly. "What you did hurt me in ways I'm still healing from. I understand. I'm not asking for forgiveness, just for a chance to do better." "What? Why now?" "Because I almost died, and the only thing I could think about was how my last conversation with my son had been full of threats and ultimatums. Because I realized that everything I thought mattered, the business, the reputation, the money, means nothing if it costs me the people I love. Because you were right that night in the servants' quarters. I needed to actually talk to my son instead of just planning his life." They talked for an hour, 2 people from opposite sides of an invisible war trying to find common ground. Charles asked about her nursing program, her sister, her plans. He listened in a way he'd never listened before, not with the patronizing attention of the wealthy toward the poor, but with genuine interest in her as a person. When they parted, he asked if she'd be willing to meet again, to perhaps slowly build something that resembled mutual respect if not friendship. She said maybe. "How would you feel if the person who destroyed your life suddenly asked for forgiveness? Could you see past the hurt to the human trying to change?" Drop your thoughts in the comments because what happens next will test both Imani and Julian in ways that will define who they truly are. ***. Charles didn't just apologize. He showed up, consistently, in ways that forced everyone to recalibrate what they thought they knew about him. He started by writing Imani a check for the wages she'd lost, plus interest, plus a formal letter of recommendation describing her as one of the most professional and capable employees his household had ever had. He offered to fund her nursing program completely, no strings attached, though she refused, some things she needed to earn herself. But she accepted his offer to pay for Zara's asthma medication and regular doctor visits. She accepted his introduction to the board of a hospital he'd helped fund, which led to a scholarship program for nursing students from low-income backgrounds. She even gradually accepted his presence in her and Julian's life, watching as this man who'd once embodied everything wrong with wealth and privilege tried to learn how to be different. Julian was the hardest to convince. He'd spent 20 years watching his father choose control over connection, money over meaning. He'd seen the cruelty his father was capable of, had felt the sting of disownment and rejection. Forgiveness didn't come easy and trust came even harder. But Charles persisted. He started showing up at the warehouse where Julian worked, not to offer him his old life back but to understand his new one. He'd watched Julian load trucks, see the physical toll it took, and instead of criticizing his son's choices, he'd ask questions. What did Julian like about the work? What did he want to do next? What dreams had he put aside when he walked away from the family business? Slowly, painfully, they rebuilt something. Not the relationship they'd had before, that was broken beyond repair, but something new. Charles taught Julian about business and finance, skills that didn't require joining the family company but that gave Julian tools for whatever path he chose. Julian taught his father about humility, about seeing people as humans first and economic units never, about building a life based on meaning instead of money. 2 years after Charles's heart attack, Imani graduated with her nursing degree. The ceremony was in a community college gymnasium, nothing like the grand graduation Julian had had from his expensive private school. But when Imani walked across that stage to receive her degree, Charles Montgomery was there in the audience beside Julian and Zara, and when she looked out into the crowd and saw all of them there, she broke down crying with joy. That night, they celebrated at the small apartment that had become home, crowded around a card table with takeout food and a grocery store cake. Charles looked around at the peeling wallpaper, the cramped quarters, the life his son had chosen over mansion living, and understood finally what he'd been too blind to see before. Julian was happy. Not comfortable, not wealthy, but genuinely happy in a way he'd never been in the house on Peachtree. "I want to invest in you," Charles said suddenly, the words surprising everyone including himself. "Not as a way to control you or bring you back into my world. As a genuine investment. You have a gift for seeing people, Julian, for understanding what they need. And Imani, you have the medical knowledge and the compassion to actually provide it. What if you started something together? A clinic maybe in an underserved neighborhood. I'd provide the startup capital, but it would be yours. Your vision, your mission, your legacy." Julian and Imani looked at each other, communicating in the silent language they'd developed over years of secret meetings and stolen conversations. They talked about this kind of dream late at night, spinning impossible fantasies about the good they could do if they had resources. But they'd never imagined those resources might come from Charles Montgomery. "Why would you do this?" Julian asked carefully. "Because I'm dying," Charles said simply. "Not today, maybe not this year, but sooner than later. The heart attack was a warning I can't ignore. And I'm realizing that everything I've built, all the buildings with my name on them, they're just monuments to my ego. They don't help anyone. They don't make the world better. They just exist to prove I was here." He looked at Imani. "You were right that night I fired you. I didn't know my own son because I'd never bothered to actually see him. And I didn't see you because I'd been taught not to look. I can't undo any of that. But I can do something meaningful with whatever time I have left. I can help you build something that actually matters." They opened the clinic 8 months later in East Point, a neighborhood that had been medically underserved for decades. It wasn't large, just a renovated storefront with 3 exam rooms and a small waiting area, but it was theirs. Imani worked as a nurse practitioner after completing additional certification, seeing patients who couldn't afford traditional healthcare. Julian handled administration, community outreach, fundraising, and the 1,000 other details that kept the doors open. They charged on a sliding scale, sometimes nothing at all, making up the difference through grants and donations that Charles helped them secure. Charles himself became the clinic's biggest advocate. He used his connections to bring in volunteer doctors, to secure donated equipment and supplies, to pressure other wealthy families to support work that actually helped their community instead of just providing tax breaks and photo opportunities. He showed up once a week to sit in the waiting room and talk to patients, learning names, hearing stories, understanding in concrete terms what his money could accomplish when it was directed toward people instead of prestige. Zara thrived. She graduated high school with honors, got accepted to Georgia State on a full scholarship, and planned to study public health so she could work in communities like the one she'd grown up in. She watched her sister and Julian build something beautiful from nothing, watched Charles transform from villain to ally, and learned that people were capable of change when they were willing to do the hard work. The clinic grew. They added mental health services, a food pantry, educational programs about diabetes and hypertension that disproportionately affected their patient population. They hired more staff, all people from the community who understood firsthand what their patients were facing. They became a hub, not just for medical care but for connection and hope in a neighborhood that hadn't had much of either. 3 years after the clinic opened, on a humid summer evening in June, Julian proposed to Imani in the very room where they'd first really met. He'd gotten permission to visit the Montgomery mansion, which his parents had put on the market after deciding they didn't need 12,000 square feet to rattle around in. They'd moved to a smaller place in Virginia Highland, closer to the clinic, closer to the life they were building. He took Imani down to the servants' quarters, to the tiny room that had once been hers, now empty and waiting for the new owners. They sat on the floor where they used to sit, backs against opposite walls like always. "Do you remember the first night I brought you a sandwich?" he asked. "I remember thinking you were going to get me fired. You were right. but wrong too. I thought getting fired was the worst thing that could happen. I didn't know it was actually the beginning. Of what? Of this. Of us. Of everything that matters. He pulled out a ring, not the massive diamond his father would have bought, but a simple band with a small stone that had belonged to his grandmother, the only piece of family jewelry Charles had offered that carried meaning instead of just value. I know this started in all the wrong ways. I know I've cost you so much. But I also know that you've taught me everything important about being human. Will you marry me? She said yes, and they were married 3 months later in a ceremony at the clinic, surrounded by patients who'd become friends, staff who'd become family, and 2 parents who'd learned that love was more valuable than legacy. 6 months after the wedding, Charles had another heart attack. This one was massive, and the doctors gave him hours, maybe days. The family gathered in his hospital room, Patricia, Julian, Imani, Zara, and Charles used what strength he had left to say the things that mattered. I wasted so much time, he told Julian, his voice barely a whisper. Chasing things that meant nothing. Treating people like they were less than human because they had less money. I'm grateful I got these last few years to see what actually matters. Grateful you were brave enough to show me. He looked at Imani. You saved my life. Not by forgiving me, I never deserved that, but by showing me what grace looks like. You could have held on to your anger forever and no one would have blamed you. But you chose to see me as someone capable of change. That changed everything. To Patricia, I'm sorry I made you smaller. Sorry I built a life where your value came from managing my image instead of being yourself. Thank you for staying, for trying, for becoming the person you always could have been. To Zara, study hard. Help people. Don't let anyone tell you your background determines your future. You're going to do remarkable things. He died that night, quietly, with all of them holding his hands. The funeral was massive. Hundreds of people from both his old world and his new one, business associates and clinic patients, wealthy donors and community members who'd benefited from his late-in-life generosity. The obituary called him a philanthropist and real estate developer, but Julian's eulogy told a different story, of a man who'd been broken open by his own cruelty, who'd faced his mortality and chosen to change, who'd learned that legacy isn't measured in buildings or money but in the lives you touch and the people you help become themselves. Charles left his estate carefully divided. Half went to Patricia, ensuring she'd be comfortable for life. A quarter went to the clinic, an endowment that would keep it running for decades. And the final quarter went to Julian with a letter that said simply, use this to build the world you believe in. I'm proud of who you've become and I'm sorry I fought so hard against it. You were right all along. What would you have done? If you were 18 and wealthy and watching someone brilliant waste away cleaning your toilets? If you were dying and realized you'd built your entire life on cruelty disguised as order? And if this story moved you, if it challenged you, if it reminded you that change is possible even when everything says it isn't, then like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that prove humanity is stronger than the systems that try to divide us. Never forget this. The smallest acts of kindness, done in secret when no one's watching, when there's nothing to gain and everything to lose, those are the acts that change the world. That's what Julian learned in a tiny room in a servant's quarters, sitting across from someone the world told him didn't matter, discovering that she mattered more than everything he'd been raised to value. That's the story. That's the truth. That's what happens when a billionaire's son sneaks into a poor maid's room every night, and instead of scandal, finds his humanity. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening.